Hello everybody. Today I'm going to be sharing with you some stories concerning my haunted classrooms at James Campbell High School located in Eva Beach, Hawaii. Now these classrooms are found in D building, rooms number D108, D208, and D308. Their rooms all attached to each other and located in the same vertical space. So they share a lot of different things. If you're familiar with pathways that spirits like to follow, once they establish a path and stuff, they stick to that one area, and sometimes they'll not only walk through a specific area, they'll walk either above or below, and they'll move their pathways accordingly. So in this instance, at Campbell High School, the first classroom that I started teaching in D building was D108 on the ground floor. Now, my experience in this classroom, when I first set up my classroom there and sitting in there, it felt like I was sitting in the middle of a trail. And this particular trail, I could feel energies coming right through my classroom, coming from the west side and going through the east side, right through the classroom, right through the walls. And a lot of times these spirits would be transient ones where they simply passing through. And I had no problems with them. And when they would come, they would enter and exit quickly and no problem. However, there were three specific spirits that decided to hang out. I'm not sure why they chose me, but specifically they decided to hang out instead of moving on. And the first spirit that I got to know was that of a little boy. And this was a young Kolohe Hawaiian boy who liked to play games. And one of his favorite games is hide the remote control. So during this time, I had remote control for my television and my VCR. And anytime I was planning to use my television and VCR to show films to my students, this bugger would hide it from me. And I'd come in the morning and, prepping for my class, and I start looking for my remote control. Normally I leave it right on my desk top, and it would be gone. And so he'd hide it all over the place. Sometimes put it on the top of my closet. Sometimes he put it in places, but it was always somewhere in the room. And actually, it helped me develop and work on my remote viewing skills, where I'd focus on the remote control itself, see it in my mind, and I'd look around the classroom and kind of like sense where this particular object was, and I got pretty good at locating it. So eventually this game got boring, because as soon as I noticed that the remote control was gone, I just closed my eyes and boom, walked right over and retrieved this remote control from where this little spirit, hid it. Anyway, this little spirit also had a way of influencing my students, and when he was there in the classroom, you could tell he was there because there was a wind that would kind of announce his presence, and the wind would come into the class and just blow things around. And this was really odd because this particular class was on the bottom floor of D building, and hardly any wind would come in. We hardly had any windows. So by having a wind come in and blow things around, it was very unusual. And that would be announcing the arrival of this young spirit in the class. And while he was there, the kids would be acting really naughty too. so he had a way of influencing the kids. The second spirit that I became aware of that liked to hang around in my class was a spirit of a young woman, beautiful woman, Hapahauli, Hawaiian, Caucasian, very beautiful, and nice dark flowing hair. She was dressed very well in white and black dress. She carried around a parasol and a hat. And looking at the manner that she dressed and the way she carried herself, you could tell that she was rich and well off and very well schooled. And I placed her probably in a time period between 1830 and 1840, during the days of the monarchy and the Kingdom of Hawaii. So that woman would come in, and she was attracted to young girls, especially young girls who were having problems at home, and it seemed to attract her. And she'd go over and hang around, and mainly there to console these girls that were having problems at home. And the final spirit that I got to meet the first time in D108 was a older Hawaiian man, and the impression that I got from him is that he was like a caretaker, kind of like a kahu for this particular area, and it was his responsibility to make sure that things were managed and ran well. And his presence in my classroom is he'd always appear when there was some kind of problem, just about right before a problem would come up, like the kids would there would be a fight. Right before a fight, he would show up, and I would feel him. An argument, something nasty about to happen, this spirit would show up and would kind of like warn me that this was going to happen. So this particular spirit followed me not only from D108 and in the Ds, but in all of the other classrooms that I was assigned to at Campbell. So I had kind of like an actually eyes and ears out there for me. Okay. The rest of the spirits that came through the classroom, like I said, D108, especially in D208, was just like a highway for spirits, so where a lot of transit spirits would be moving through the class, and they'd come and go, and I'd sense them, but they didn't hang around, and they knew that I could see them, but they just were kind of like moving through this place. When I finally moved my classroom from D108 to the second floor, D208, I started a tradition, and this tradition was every Halloween, if we were in school, or if Halloween was on weekends or whatever, I'd have time in my class to share ghost stories with my kids. So we'd go through the lesson for the day, and I'd reserve the last 20 to 30 minutes to telling ghost stories. And many of the ghost stories that I shared with them were the same stories that I shared in my previous videos. Anyway, one time I was telling my stories, and we ended, and there's still about 15 minutes left of class, and so I looked for volunteers to share if they had, if any of my students had any ghost stories they wanted to share. And sitting in the back of the class was a young Filipino man, a young Filipino boy, and he raised his hand and says, Mister, I have a story to share. So I called on him, and he started sharing his ghost story. And he started to tell us about his grandma, who had passed away about 5 years before, and how his grandma was visiting with him at night. And when he was sad, the grandma would somehow show up. And while he was talking about his grandma, I noticed something, an energy surge occurred in my classroom. And I looked towards the back door, and through the back door, I saw a shadow walk through the door and enter my classroom, and slowly started to walk in the back of the classroom, walking towards this young man who was telling the story. And to get a better idea on what I was looking at, I closed my eyes and asked myself to show me what I need to see. And so I closed my eyes, and using my spiritual eyes, what I saw was an old Filipino lady dressed in black, bent over, and walking with a cane, and she had a Toscani in her mouth. I could smell the Toscani, and I could hear the tapping on the floor that was caused by her cane. Now, this this particular person, or this ghost, walked up and stood right next to this young man who just finished the story, and the kids clapped their hands, and everybody was saying, "Oh, good story, thank you for sharing." And so I'm looking, and I see the man, see the boy, and I see the ghost right next to him. So I looked at him, and I says, I have a question to ask you. And I said, "Shoot, what?" He says, why did you folks dress your grandma in black when you folks buried her?" He kind of looked at me confused. He says, "Well, it's something you gotta ask my uncles. They're the ones that decided." And so I looked at him, and I looked at the spirit. I says, your grandma, does she walk with her back kind of like bent over, and does she use a cane?" And the kid looked at me and says, "Yeah, well, she hurt her back because she was working in a cane field, and she hurt her back, so she had to use a cane." And I says, "It looked like your grandma really enjoyed Toscani, eh?" And he stood up and looked at me, Mister, how you know so much about my grandma?" I look at the boy and says, "Because your grandma's standing right next to you." Now, as soon as I said that, the kids that were sitting in my class spread like cockroaches. They ran out of my classroom, took a beeline, and they ran screaming out of my class, leaving only me and this young man in the classroom with grandma. So I walked up to the boy, and the boy by then was sobbing, was crying. And so put my hand on him, and I says, "You know what, your grandma came here today. She realizes that you miss her, and she loves you, and she wants the best for you." Now this boy, it was surprising to see him in my classroom that day, because he was one of those boys that hardly came to class, but he did come to class that day. And a change occurred to him after his grandma came in, because from that day on, he attended every class. Now, the aftermath of this, shortly after I gathered my kids back in a class and, guaranteed them that grandma had left and grandma wasn't going to do any harm to them. From that point on, this boy kind of like turned around and started to come to school more often. And the interesting thing later is that later during the day, as my other classes started coming to my class, it says, "Mister, is Grandma still here?" And I said, "No, no, no, she's gone." And so my classroom became known as Grandma's class. So this is an interesting story that occurred to me and this class. And for some of you students who remember that was in my classroom, I'd appreciate you folks feedback and verify this story. Okay, and this is Dave Wallace saying thank you for listening. And if you like the stories that I share, please share it with others and subscribe. Aloha.